Ole Molvig, and I am history faculty, teach history of science here at Vanderbilt, and I'm also with the Vanderbilt Institute for Digital Learning as one of its assistant directors. And we, along with Zoe LeBlanc and Derek from CFT, have organized this session on conversations on digital pedagogy. And I was going to ask Zoe, who's kind of one of the motivating forces behind this, tell us briefly about her interest in this, and then Derek will tell us a bit more about
No, I'm just going to pass around the sign-in sheet.
Sign-in sheet. So get this one in.
Take it away, Zoe.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. The kind of impetus for this workshop was a bit my own experience, both at CFT and Vital. I was a Haystack Scholar initially at CFT, and then I'm now a graduate fellow at Vital. And I was really excited about teaching with digital tools. I had read all these Haystack blogs. I had, kind of scanned the web, and I started trying to teach digitally, to have digital pedagogy, and there was a lot of obstacles, and I got very, very frustrated. And there was something about kind of just only having blogs to read. There was this kind of very positive narrative from those where I felt like I wasn't getting the full story. And so I felt like there was a real kind of, community on campus that felt the same way, that was interested in trying digital tools in their teaching, but didn't quite know how to go about it, didn't know what to avoid, what was the pitfalls, what was, the benefits of it. And so what we really wanted this workshop to be was kind of a move away from the hype and the efficiency of digital tools towards a kind of meaningful, conscious engagement with digital pedagogies in teaching, not kind of just, I do these fancy things and they look pretty, and so that's digital teaching, but really kind of thinking through, well, what does this add to the classroom and how can we integrate this in a really kind of mindful way? And so, of course, I came to Derek and Oli, and we have this conversation set up today. Thank you, everyone, for coming again. And we also have another one coming up on flipped classrooms in April. So please also come to that, because I think these are going to be great experiences for everyone.
April 7th, same time, same place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm happy to co-sponsor this series. Teaching with technology is one of my passions, certainly. And as I've worked with faculty here and elsewhere, I do see this interest in really kind of understanding how does the technology integrate with the teaching? How does it support learning in different ways? How do you facilitate the process with students? How do you build it into assessment? So I'm hopeful that we'll get to some pretty concrete things here today. Maybe not here's how to use this tool, but here's how to build a course or an activity around this tool. So I'm looking forward to that. And I do have a sign-in sheet. I'm going to pass this around. If you can put your name or check your name off, we will only report your attendance in aggregate numbers. So that's how we use these. Thanks.
Great. All right. Well, our first speaker is Don Rodriguez. He's a PhD student in the Department of English. His research areas include early modern intellectual history, media studies, and digital humanities. Over the last several years, he's worked with Vanderbilt in partnership with Coursera to TA one of its pilot MOOCs, Jay Clayton's Online Games, Literature, New Media, and Narrative. He's been working with the Haystack Scholarship Program, the Curb Center for Arts, and at Vanderbilt and elsewhere, he has taught or assisted in teaching courses on English literature, comparative literature, writing and rhetoric, ethics, as well as media studies. So, Don?
So, let's try this again. All right, can everyone hear me and see that? Yeah, okay. All right, that is a somewhat provocative title. To ground, I guess, what I want to talk about today, I want to say a few words about my pedagogy sort of in general, and how I think about Twitter fitting within it. And in order to do that, I have to say a disclaimer about, or make a disclaimer rather, about how I use Twitter, which is mostly through my pedagogy and teaching. I'm not a big tweeter. In fact, I've been somewhat of a skeptic of Twitter. So maybe my perspective here will be a little, different than some of the others that we'll see, or maybe it won't. I don't know. But what I have found really great about Twitter, among a range of other tools and non-technological tools like excursions outside of the classroom, is the ways that it can expand upon the sensorial capacities to engage students with material that they encounter. And that's a concept, that's a very big idea that I'm happy to talk more about in Q&A. But it's something that really is an important component of my teaching sort of ethos. And it's why I use Twitter, more so than any other reason, frankly. So yeah, with that said, I'll just get into what the substance of this is about. Related to that concept, you know, does Twitter break like the four walls of the classroom, this idea of Twitter like sort of shattering conventions? It made me think of Dead Poet Society a little bit, right? Is Twitter like the new, one of these new activities where people are standing up on their desks, but instead of standing up on their desks, are they like going out into the internet? I don't think so, and I don't think it should. But on the other hand, I think what it does do is it does some really interesting subversive work that allows us to think about challenging the notion of a classroom as a stable architectural, temporal, or metaphysical space. I think it allows us to think of, engage with ludic or playful intellectual moments in the classroom that might otherwise be foreclosed. I think what it does also is it creates intellectual and creative and affective or emotional bonds between students and students and students and teachers that surprised me and that really added a really rich dimension to teaching. And really, for the traditionalists among us, it really opens up development of modes of analysis and critical thinking and furthers them that surprised me as well. So I want to focus on that today in terms of Derek's, wherever he is, notion that what can we get practically out of using Twitter? In terms of three activities that I've developed using Twitter that can stimulate sensory and intellectual engagement with the tool. These three activities I've loosely called synthesizing material, artifactual missions, and flash readings, all of which contribute to, in my experience, deeper discussion and more engaged analytic assessment of texts and artifacts themselves. So in order to do this, I think it's actually necessary to look at the prompts themselves. So please bear with me as we do this. This is a slightly modified version of a prompt that I've recycled a few times from Frankenstein. Pick a scene from Frankenstein that relates in a substantive way to the argument or themes you've just developed in Essay 1. So this is coming right on the heels of a very, very substantive, in-depth research project. Tweet a snapshot of the passage and comment upon it. Be prepared to discuss your selection with the class in conjunction with your essay as a way of, first of all, sharing your thoughts on past work, and likewise as a way of bridging these thoughts into future possible directions. And then the second component is plan on giving a 5-minute informal presentation with your tweet and your essay thesis serving as the basis for your presentation. So what this assignment effectively does is it allows students, it forces them to think about to distill the ideas that they have just spent like maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks working on into a tweet. And then to present upon it and to think about its ramifications in terms of the work they've done before and the work that they may be doing in the future. It's been great in terms of thinking about, for them, thinking about trends in their thought. So for example, here's a student who has distilled her thoughts. In Frankenstein, class doesn't determine happiness in doesn't determine happiness, comma, in Bachelors and Maids, that's Melville's short story, Paradise of Bachelors, Tartarus of Maids, it's unclear. This is a student who's concerned with class as a sort of thematic dimension throughout this particular course. And this assignment, what it does is it allows the students to think about what their preoccupations and engagements are. This is a student who chose to say every advancement comes with the risk of uncertainty. Here we have a quote about the so-called Bride of Frankenstein. This student's really interested in how technology pushes the limits of human engagement. So this is a theme that the student seized upon and will continue to seize upon in his work. And then, again, of course, the student comes into class, talks about this, and it became a really rich discussion that took up the entire class, more or less. And, of course, it had an afterlife in the Twitter sphere. Artifacts, internet artifacts. This is a fun one. Find a real-world example of industrialization or automation and tweet it. In doing this, try to find an example that reflects social power and inequities reflected in Melville's story. If you have room in your tweet, hashtag Tartarus of Maids or Paradise of Bachelors, these are the two spheres of the story, to indicate if there's a gendered component of the type of automation or labor that you've discovered. And here we have a student who discovered that there was a relationship between Amazon's droning of information with the first part of the Paradise of Bachelors. What was great about this is students came back and said, no, actually that relates more to the Tartarus of Maids, right? So it introduced a really interesting discussion in class and beyond. In another class, a student related The Little Mermaid to Haggard's She, a 19th century text that, and you can see the hashtag up there, 2 doors. It's a pun on, well, Commodores and the Tudor monarchy. It was a class all about the queens and sovereigns and the Tudor dynasty. So it was kind of a witty sort of thing they came up with also, democratically. Finally, I want to talk about flash readings. These are things that I do in class or prior to class that allow students to sort of think quickly about what texts are doing and how they might engage with them in quick ways, but then that could lead to more sustained engagements. So, for example, identify a moment in Coriolanus. This is a text that we just read in a class that focuses upon X discussion. Take a photo of the passage. Your photo should clearly indicate aspects of the text you wish to draw attention to. So I asked them to underline, circle, highlight, etc. Are there particular words that you want us to look at? Next, ask a question provoked by the passage and tweet this along with your photo. What does your passage ask us to consider? How might your passage ask us to challenge assumptions circulating in class discussion about this text? Sometimes what I'll do is I'll put a scholarly quote in the middle of this and ask them to, are you challenging, challenge the scholarly approach to the text, right? There's different ways to work with this sort of somewhat formulaic approach. In fact, this is a modification where I had a scholar's quote, a couple of them here. And this is what students came up with. So we have a quote here, proof that he, Coriolanus, is only a machine, question. Is there still some internal resistance against his quote creator? And we have a selection here where the student is commenting upon Volumnia, Coriolanus' mother. By the way, this is a Shakespeare play that no one reads, just in case you don't know. Everyone should read it. Go out and read it. It's amazing. But yeah, Volumnia, the critic argued, is the puppeteer of Coriolanus. And the student is arguing against this position. And it was a very provocative and challenging way to say, you know what, critic, I have a different point of view. This passage indicates that Coriolanus is not merely just a machine. In fact, there's some internal resistance that indicates he's thinking on his own. Here we have Vandy Elevator Gossip, who's adopted his own interesting little name there. And he's also developing his, as you can see, plebes don't understand, which is the term used in the text. They should act without thinking. How much should you follow authority? Again, another example of a student thinking through, thinking critically through the text, but also demonstrating how the text, he's developing his own interest and modes of interest in class, right, through these activities. This is another class, Aisha. This is the white female hierarch of the Amahagr tribe in Haggard's 19th century text. A similar kind of exercise and activity here. And you can see how this can get into the realm of the absurd or humorous, even as very serious subject matter is tackled. Which brings me to the final thing I want to say about how Twitter can really forge interesting forms of play, experiment, and community. Here's a moment where a student tweeted to me, you know, shout out to Don Rodriguez for memorizing page 34. I got a big gold star, right? Which, you know, great for me. But it was a fun and sort of endearing moment. Another moment, like, you know, in reading this book, students formed moments of solidarity around the sort of racist things that were happening in it, but also this interesting sense of humor about racism and how the absurdity of it emerged in the Twitter sphere, and this came to inform, in turn, discussions we had in class. This kind of ludic or playful element, in turn, affected me. And then I decided, you know what, Katy Perry's video, you know, speaks to a lot of the issues we're talking about. So I ended up tweeting this video, and that we really engaged in an interesting pop culture sort of discussion about the relationship between the text we were studying and the greater pop culture community. And to conclude, one day I missed class, and I had to go to a conference, and this is to give you a sense of the kind of bonds that are forged. We were reading Alice in Wonderland, and one of my students tweeted, "You may have noticed, but I'm not all there myself. Don Rodriguez may not be here, but we're still having a super discussion." So the sense of community and play that Twitter can provide, you can't necessarily predict what will come out of it, but the outcomes can be really fantastic and generative. So thank you.
I'll give each speaker about 2 question maximum specific to their particular project first, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. At the end, we can have a more. So there's 1 or 2 questions for Don. Yes, please.
How do you evaluate this? I mean, is this part of a grade evaluation, or is it extra? Do people resist this?
Great question. That's 2 questions. I'll start with the second one. How do I evaluate? Do students resist this? Yes. Some students resist even having an online presence, which I found fascinating. I felt, you know, well, everyone uses Twitter. You know, they're these so-called digital natives, right? Everyone's going to want to be on Twitter. No. In the current class I'm teaching, 8 out of the 11 students did not have a Twitter account. And 1 student or 2 students openly resisted having one whatsoever. So they created accounts that would completely dissociate themselves and their identities from the accounts that they had. But once they realized, you know, that there was a certain sense of anonymity that would be allowed for. And also that I would, as you saw, I sought permissions before, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I asked every student whose images are here whether I could use their names. And so there's a strong sense of trust in terms of using these images. And and working with these students. So I don't know if that addresses that question about resistance. And that's something I think maybe at the end we can all speak to. But in terms of assessment, I just view this as a mode of class participation. I don't grade these things, and I really don't want to get into that sort of thing. What I do find is that there's different, of course, you know, as with anything, certain students will participate more and engage more deeply. One of these students earlier, she gave a PowerPoint presentation based on her tweet. And, you know, I mean, some students will do absolutely incredible things. Some students will dial it in. Some students won't do it at all. And it will all, you know, shake out in the end. Some students will get a better class participation grade. It's factored into the syllabus. That's how I factor it in. Yeah.
In the first example that you gave regarding synthesis, it was very clear that what you were asking them to do was going to then show up in class. They were required to perform a project presentation. Do the other things that you mentioned, do you also put those into class discussion on content in some way, or are they extraneous, or not extraneous, but external to the class discussion?
Those three things that I showed today, they're all integral to class. And they all materialize in ways that directly influence class discussion. There are many other ways that I use Twitter that I didn't talk about. These three activities, one of the reasons I wanted to show them to you today is because they are very concrete and specific things I've seen that work effectively in class.
And is it your expectation that students will have reviewed looked at all the tweets from all their classmates prior to showing up?
It's also part of the requirement, though. I mean, as with you know, a lot of things, they're doing their work right up to the minutes before class, so it doesn't always work out. But what what I'll have to do is, you know, on a day where there's an assignment like this, I'll have them bring their computers or their phones if they choose. Everyone, you know, get on the feed and start looking at everyone's feedback. So it becomes an integral part.
Excellent. All right, let's go ahead and hand over the microphone to Vivian next. Vivian Finch is a PhD candidate in German, works on a dissertation exploring the publication and reception histories of Brazilian literature in post-war Germany. She's taught introductory courses through intermediate language courses here at Vanderbilt with an instructional focus on the use of digital media in the foreign language classroom. She also worked with the CFT and the hashtag Scholars Program at Vanderbilt as well. So, Vivian.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so just to, I guess, like Don, I'm going to give a little bit of background information as to my own personal relationship with Twitter. I signed on with a personal Twitter account in March of 2009, and was just kind of there just to explore it, see what it was about. But it wasn't until about a year or so later that I started thinking a little bit more about what Twitter could do in a foreign language classroom. And where that came from was my own personal interest in kind of what was going on in Germany from a news perspective. Twitter has always been really good historically about breaking news before some of the bigger news networks do. And so I was following everything from trending topics in Germany to major newspapers, news networks in Germany. I'm also a big fan of Bayern München, big soccer team, and also the Berlin Eisbären, the polar bears. They're a big hockey team. And some of those players are on Twitter, and so I was following them too, and really getting sort of a different sense of German culture than I had before. And so it was something that I wanted my students to experience as well. And it was something that as a non-native speaker of German, teaching German, I also wanted my students to get as many authentic target language experiences as possible, and Twitter seemed to address a lot of those possibilities. So when I started using Twitter in the classroom, it was primarily within sort of a homework capacity where students could research trending topics in Germany for that week, and they'd come back and they'd kind of, in the beginning of class, talk about the things that they had found. One discovered sort of the up-and-coming German Justin Bieber, and so we talked about some of those lyrics too. And it seemed to me that in the process of experimenting with Twitter in the classroom, it was very clear to me that I had to develop a very specific approach with it, because students, while also sometimes excited about experimenting in that way, they also wanted to know exactly what this meant in terms of their performance in class, right? And so a lot of getting them on board with Twitter in the classroom was also being really intentional about why it was important, what it was doing for them that maybe standard classroom activities wouldn't do. And once they started seeing these possibilities of kind of driving letting their own interests in German culture drive the sort of things that they bring into the classroom, and being able to participate directly with people in Germany, that seemed to really bring them in and overcome some of this resistance that we've talked about a little bit. But that does speak to an important point that was brought up, is, you know, I had probably in any given German class that I taught, I had maybe 2 or 3 students that had a Twitter handle. Some of them were active, maybe 1 or 2. One sort of had it, looked at it, said, not for me. And then some people knew of it, especially sort of the way news media use Twitter, embed them in networks and that sort of thing, or on their websites. All the students have an idea of how Twitter is used, but getting them on board required a pretty quick tutorial, a talk about what it means to participate in Twitter in a classroom environment, sort of where that line is for student privacy, and we had that conversation pretty openly during that process. And needless to say, this led me to the development of a really intentional project in a German 104 class that I taught a while back, and that's what this is about, adventures in Twitter fiction and student-generated digital storytelling. This German 104 class, just to give a little background, it's an intermediate German language course, and it's focused on German short stories. So the overarching question was, throughout the whole semester, was what is a short story? What does that look like? What does it mean when we say short story? What does that genre mean? And then what is a German short story? So how do German short stories look different from our traditional ideas of short stories in the American context? And so what we did, and what I thought of to do, was to create a project in which students came together using Twitter, because they had been using Twitter throughout the course of the semester, to use Twitter in a way that reflected some of these ideas that we were grappling with in the short stories that we were reading. And for German short stories, one of the big things that's explored is this idea of a narrative and a linear narrative, and a lot of these short stories played with that idea of linear storytelling and what that looked like. And so what we did was we created this project, and it was treated, as far as value, grading value, in the same way that an essay would be evaluated in terms of percentage, grade percentage. And then what I had students do was they all came together, decided on topic, on characters, who wanted to take what position, sort of a general plot line. But then what they did was they came together on Twitter, and in a span of 24 hours tweeted as their characters and wrote this short story together. What we did is we used a class hashtag and then also the story hashtag, what you'll see here, Aufstein. That was the story hashtag. And we also used the hashtag Twitter fiction. So here's the other aspect of this. There is such a thing as Twitter fiction. So there are people on Twitter who write stories. And this has been a development recently. There's even a Twitter fiction festival. It's happening this month, I believe. And so I wanted students also to kind of be a part of this public sphere of digital storytelling. And so what they did is they would tweet in the process of their short story, they would tweet using the story hashtag, because that hashtag would be important in terms of collecting the story together so you could see it. And then also the Twitter fiction hashtag, which immediately plugged them in with the larger conversations around Twitter fiction or fiction on Twitter. And so the students kind of took this and ran with it. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they were in charge. They were the ones making the decisions about where the story was going to go in real time. And they went sort of above and beyond with, including pictures. And I will explain the bloody rock, because that might be a little off-putting and maybe people don't know what's going on. So they decided on a whodunit sort of story. And it was a geology professor and their students, and they go on a field trip, and one of the students disappears. And everyone else is trying to figure out where the student went, right? And so this is actually a clue, right, provided by one of the other characters. They came across this bloody rock. And so one of the things that's really interesting about this type of storytelling is that it really points back to this question that we had about nonlinear narrative storytelling within the context of the short story genre, especially in German short stories. But I wanted to make that a little bit more visible in terms of their short story. So one of the things I did was I plotted the Twitter fiction storyline. So what is this? Well, so each character, or each student in this case, has a particular colored line. And so everyone starts at the same point because physically that's where they started within the context of their story, location-wise within the story. And then as time elapses, it tracks their interactions with one another, but then also their physical space of where they're headed. And these are just some examples of tweets that happened. So for example, the student that disappeared is the student, the character that disappeared is the character in blue. And the last thing you hear is, "Hilf mir bitte." Can anyone hazard a guess as to what that meant? "Help me, please," right? And then radio silence for that student for a while. This, for example, is a thud they hear in the forest. And these two characters are the ones that were closest to that thud, and they want to go explore what that meant. So the students really took it and ran with it. They were using probably a lot more German colloquial terms than I had seen before, and a lot of this has to do with sort of the tendencies of Twitter anyway in German. There's a lot of colloquial language that happens, abbreviations, and they were adopting these within their tweets in this story. And so I would love to say a little bit more, but in the interest of time, I want to move to kind of what's important about this project. So going meta, behind the scenes of the Twitter fiction project, there were some learning objectives that I really wanted to make to really have them stand out within the context of this project. One of them was to work collaboratively, have students come together and really work with one another to develop some sort of project, some sort of lasting product within this classroom. Communication in the target language. They probably used more German within this span of 24 hours of storytelling than they did potentially in their entire lives up until this point, right? And then considering the short story genre, so really sort of dialing it back, stepping back, and thinking about it within the context of the entire course. What does this mean? What does this project mean in terms of impacting the way I'm thinking about short stories? And this came out in their final papers, where they were citing this project and the Twitter storytelling perspective in terms of the way they were conceiving of nonlinear narratives. And then developing digital literacy. In the course of this, they explored so many different aspects of Twitter that they could potentially take down the road, either for professional development, for other classes, or even just for personal interest. And then sort of the big so what. Expand the capacity for critical thinking and collaboration, deepening a connection with the target language, students taking ownership of their own learning process, so really determining what they wanted to do with this project from the very beginning, developing skills useful beyond the course, and then the last one, and this is something that sort of really struck a chord with me in terms of what the CFT has done in the past with their big theme on students as producers, and really having students think as contributors to their disciplines. And so students as producers in terms of storytelling in German. And really putting that out there through that Twitter fiction hashtag and going public with it. So I will leave it there. I know there are a ton of more questions that I could talk about and everything, but I'll leave it there for now. So thank you.
All right. One or two questions for... Do you want to field a question or two?
Sure. Yes.
6 students in the class, or was that just one?
6 students in this particular course, and that's reflective of intermediate language courses in the German program. Yes.
Could you estimate the mean latency time between responses as students collectively created short stories?
So.
Did they reflect much before they tweeted the next thing? Or?
So I think, it really depended on student schedules within that span of 24 hours, and students took a survey after the course to give feedback on this project and on the course in general. And one of the things that they talked about was extending that period of 24 hours to 48 hours, because for a lot of students, they have a lot going on in the span of a day. And I used some analytics to look at exactly that, sort of the trends of tweeting within that span of 24 hours. And there were a lot of students that tweeted right around dinner time. There were a lot of students that tweeted close to midnight. There were some students that were tweeting at 2 and 3 in the morning, which should have been, probably was really interesting for those students who woke up in the morning to jump back into the story. And I think in that respect, there was a lot more sort of on your feet tweeting, because sometimes you couldn't think that far in advance to craft a tweet. It really had to be in real time because there were other people jumping in. And so I think students probably felt a little bit of stress in terms of that real-time sort of on-your-feet thinking, but I think they would have liked maybe a little bit more time with it, and that's something that if I were to do again, I probably would extend that period from 24 to 48 hours. Yeah.
So Amy Hammurabi is an assistant professor of medicine, health, and society, University Field of Disability Studies and Feminist Science and Technology Studies. Amy's manuscript project, Building Access, looks at the history and theory of universal design and disability access in the 20th and 21st centuries. Courses Amy teaches include bionic bodies, cyborg cultures, public health and the built environment, theories of the body, and the graduate pro seminar on medicine, health, and society.
How's my volume? Is this working? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use Twitter in the classroom for participation. But before I do that, I want to say just a bit about how I came up with the idea of doing this and really kind of giving credit to the people that I borrowed different parts of it from. So the first time I ever thought about this was when I was a graduate student at Emory. In the course of my pedagogical training, I went to a workshop with Brian Croxall, who is a digital humanities person and an English PhD, and he was using Twitter in the classroom. This was, like 2009 or something. He was using Twitter in the classroom to facilitate real-time conversations about poetry in this really interesting way. And so he did a demonstration that basically involved showing sort of like what the previous two presenters did, showing a piece of text and then having a Twitter feed where students had written to analyze different parts of it. And that was something that kind of got me thinking about my teaching style as I was doing my research on universal design, which is a concept that basically is about how if we design the world to be accessible to disabled people, it'll be much more usable and beneficial to non-disabled people as well. And so I was thinking through kind of some of the ways I can apply this to my teaching beyond the realms of architecture and product design and things like that I study empirically as a historian. And so Twitter seemed like an interesting thing to me. It took a few years for me to actually start doing it, but a couple of things inspired me to use it in the classroom. One is cart transcription, which is a technology that at conferences in the field of disability studies, which is one of my primary fields, this is something that becomes available a lot. And it's here I'm showing an image of a bunch of people at a meeting in a room, and there's a PowerPoint on a screen to the right, and then on the left there's the cart transcription. And it's kind of like a court reporter who just writes down what everyone's saying, and it's projected on a screen for everyone to see. And the immediate reason to have this is that if there are deaf or hearing impaired people in the room and there's no interpreter, it's beneficial to have a transcription. The second reason is that it creates a textual document of a meeting, which is good to have later. And then the third reason is that there are just a lot of people who benefit from reading text as it's happening in real time. And so when I went to my first Society for Disability Studies meeting, I encountered cart transcription for the first time, and they have these in every single room in every presentation. And it kind of reminded me of the Twitter feed, in the way that it was always updating in real time, and that the conversation was captured visually as well as auditorily and in a spoken way. And then while this was kind of going on, I also went to a workshop on audio description, which is a method that is typically used to create accessible information for blind and visually impaired people. And here I'm showing this image of a television, and there's a little speech bubble that says, "Blue sky and sun shining on a field of yellow flowers." And that's the typical way of doing audio description. And someone will get a video or a YouTube video, and it'll have someone sort of narrating what can be seen on the screen at the same time as other stuff is happening. And the workshop that I went to was led by Georgina Klieg and Josh Mealy, who both identify as blind people. And they had developed this method of collective audio description, which was based on the idea that collective knowledge production is valuable, and that giving people access to what is in an image is valuable for all these pedagogical reasons beyond just the immediate, making sure that a blind person can see an image on a screen. And so the collective method has to do with a bunch of people doing this kind of at the same time and creating a textual document of it, and then also giving you something to kind of refer back to and to contest. And so in collective audio description, people can argue about whether or not the description is accurate. So I was thinking about all of these things, and just as I was teaching my first class, these were on my mind as I was wondering how to combine them together, and to make them available in a classroom for students who may or may not identify as having a disability, but just thinking about why it's good to have students say explicitly what is in an image instead of assuming that everyone agrees that it's the same thing, or why it's good to have a textual document that is kind of projected on a screen of what people are saying at the same time that people are actually saying it. And this relates to one of the core ideas in universal design, which is multimodality. And that's the idea of presenting information in different modes or media, making it available in different ways, just in order to enhance learning experiences for people with different learning styles and stuff. But I wanted to make it participatory. And so Twitter seemed like a really good technology to do that because students could all engage in this at the same time. And it could be a way of participating for students who are not comfortable talking in class, or that's not really what their preference is. And I was kind of one of those students also when I was an undergraduate. And I would say one thing at the very end of class after I'd processed what everyone else had said. But if someone had made this kind of textual mode available to me, I probably would have participated a lot more. So I've kind of tried out different versions of this, and I'll just show you a few examples of how it's worked. Here at Vanderbilt, I teach a class called Bionic Bodies, Cyborg Cultures. That's a class about disability and technology, and it looks at things like the history of prosthetics and disabled people as inventors of technology as well as users. And the hashtag that I used for that class is critical disability tech, which is one that I chose on purpose for its legibility both to students and people outside of Vanderbilt. And I actually encourage other people to watch the hashtag while I'm in class, and people in my field. So what usually happens is before I go to class, I tweet or post on Facebook, today in class we're going to talk about this. And then people, if they want to join in the conversation, they can do that. They go to Critical Disability Tech. Students also during class post things and post questions and comments. And I actually, and this is kind of scandalous to some people, but I actually encourage my students to bring their laptops to class. I don't allow them to use cell phones at all, and my TA watches them from the back of the classroom to make sure they're not on Facebook. But I encourage them to bring their computers to class and to do things like look up articles that might be related to what we're talking about, because I kind of think they're going to do that no matter what, and it's better to have a document of it. So this is part of the feed from Critical Disability Tech. A bunch of people have posted different stuff from class that, different things have reminded them of. And that creates like all these conversations. So here's one where people are relating some of the technologies that they've found on the internet or come across to our readings. There are people kind of, like we had this whole debate about whether those Super Bowl commercials about disability were a good representation of disability. All of that stuff happens there. Another thing that this has enabled that I also kind of take from the field of disability studies is live tweeting, which is the idea of using Twitter to create access to, say, a presentation for people who are not there in physically, or or who may just benefit from having a textual record. So a few weeks ago, I hosted a speaker, Sarah Hendren, who also works on disability and technology. I think a few folks here came to that talk. And I live tweeted both her presentation in my class and her presentation at the talk itself. And at the talk, we had a screen with a Twitter projection, and we made the hashtag, which was still Critical Disability Tech, available to everyone so that they could follow along. And then that one also had the additional hashtag of investigating normal, which was the title of her talk. And so what that did was, in the space, it kind of replicated something like CART transcription, and which would ordinarily be an enormous amount of work, and you'd have to pay someone who's credentialed in that to do it. I still ended up doing a lot of work, but there were a lot of people who chimed in and helped out with that. So like Derek Breff was there. He helped live tweet some of it. People posted questions that way. And then a lot of people who were interested in the talk who couldn't physically be there participated remotely, which is something that I think is enormously valuable, especially when you're talking about really contemporary technologies. The people who make the technologies sometimes want to talk to you about it while you're live tweeting. Another thing that's related to that is Ken McLeish, who's another assistant professor in MHS, and I host an undergraduate conference every semester where we combine our classes, and he teaches a class on war in the body. We combine it with my bionic bodies class. We arrange our students into panels, they give presentations, and then we have a different hashtag for that conference, which is modes of embodiment. And we encourage students to use it in the same way as during class. And what that has actually done, in addition to creating these little side conversations that happen during people's presentations, is that sometimes the people that they are presenting about actually engage in the conversation with them. So we've had Paralympic athletes, we've had someone who's a really famous disability hip-hop dancer participated. We've had a bunch of designers, because designers love Twitter, and they're just always on it. And so that's been a really amazing thing, because it's allowed us to ask questions in real time with people who otherwise would just be kind of objects in this educational space. They've actually kind of had a voice in that space and been able to participate remotely. And it just creates this kind of record of it, so that when I'm selling the class to students at the beginning of the semester, I can say, and we're going to have this conference, you can go back to this hashtag and see what we did last year at the conference. And people post pictures of the space and all that too. One last thing, just so that people know, is you can use a technology called Storify to compile tweets into a story that you post on the internet. I did this last year with our MHS Politics of Health conference, which was at the Politics of Health hashtag, and there's a Storify for that you can read. It's a lot of my tweets and also other people's, and pictures and things like that. You can it's a really good tool for arranging everything into something coherent, so that then you have a record of it, and you can actually, we send this out with like our annual report to people when we send it out digitally. So it's just a way to translate that into something that's a little bit more institutionally legible. All right, that's it.
A couple of questions for Amy in particular, and then we'll open it up for everybody.
Yes.
So I do a lot of live tweeting since I started using Twitter less than a year ago, probably, but I really got into it, this notion of social note-taking. And one effect of that is if I'm tweeting a conference, I'll get to know the people I'm tweeting with, and we'll start favoriting each other's tweets, et cetera, and then when we finally meet in person, which sometimes we do, it's sort of, hey, you know this person. Is there that kind of effect that you get in the classroom? I mean, is that what is community building and a sense of closeness among students a benefit of that?
It definitely happens with the conference that we have, especially because I think, in the classroom, the students know each other, they've actually seen each other's faces and stuff, but I've noticed that people have these kind of like a sense of kinship with each other around things that they agree upon at our student conference, because it's usually, there are a lot of contentious debates that happen there, and they'll kind of be like, oh yeah, I like that thing you tweeted, and they'll talk to each other during the breaks, and yeah, I think that sense of conviviality is such an important part of what Twitter can promote, even though there's a lot of not so convivial stuff that happens on Twitter too. You have to be careful about that kind of thing, but yeah, for sure. Yes.
In the Storify application that you were talking about, I hadn't heard about that. Does it de-identify the people who are tweeting?
I don't know if it can.
In terms of student anonymity and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if that option is available, but one thing I'll say about this is that there's kind of a presumption with Twitter that there is no anonymity, and I think that that's like okay as long as everyone consents to it and knows that they're crafting an online persona for themselves, that they take responsibility for doing in a very deliberate way. So students who don't want to be identified, I always tell them to just pick a weird name, kind of like your elevator gossip person, and then just tell me who they are. But I actually think it's not such a bad thing, because people will Google you, and if you have a bunch of smart things you said on the internet associated with your name, that's better than something else coming up. So,
So, no, I don't think there's any way to be anonymous in Storify.
Tweet today just announced team tweet capacity. Have you heard about that? So I think that's like a collaborative tweeting, so people can have access to the same account. I suspect that you could also restrict its visibility just to those. I think you should check it out. I just, was just reading in the announcement this morning. And the other thing is that Storyfy today announced the new Twitter cards will now allow you to carry pictures and videos inside the Twitter card, and so that people can then go through the Storyfy Twitter card directly to the link or video without exiting it, so that they're still in your Storyfy thread. So 2 new tools.
If you want to see it in action, I shared the link to the Storyfy of the Twitter fiction story that my students did on my handle, and you can see those embedded Twitter cards that Storyfy just updated. It's actually pretty cool. You can flip through it directly within Twitter. You don't actually have to leave Twitter in order to access Storyfy.
Thank you, everyone, for a great panel. I loved it. I have 2 questions, and they're kind of related. The first is, we've kind of brought up evaluation and assessment, but I was just hoping that you could all kind of talk more explicitly about how much work you felt the students needed to put into this. I mean, was this something that they seemed to feel take a lot of time, or was it something they were doing right before class? And then secondly, what is the legacy of these kind of Twitter pieces within your classes? I mean, is it something that you're going to reuse the same hashtag and have that again, or is it just Storyfy? Are you frustrated with kind of Twitter's archival policies at all? I know I've been. So just kind of thinking about, is this a living being still, or is it kind of just a legacy piece that you put on the shelf?
Well, it's something that I've struggled with. For now, I'm in terms of the hashtag. Each class that I teach has its own hashtag, and so there is this sense of finality. For at least in terms of where I'm at right now, and I really want to think about challenging this. When the class ends, it sort of ends. The hashtag still is out there, right? And so every now and then I will tweet out something with the class hashtag so as to reinvigorate discussion, and that's happened recently with my tutors class, and it's really fun to see the afterlives that the class can have, but yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
For me, there are a couple of aspects at play. One is you can only search back for a hashtag so far. So inevitably, if you haven't documented something off of Twitter to save it, to use that term really loosely, it's going to, at some point, disappear from active Twitter. And so there is that aspect that you're kind of working against time if you are thinking about it in terms of some really long-lasting project. But if you're not, it does bring into question what we consider digital literature to be and how long it's supposed to last and what that's supposed to look like. And so we're entering into a different conversation. And it's one that I think we could enter into with our students, right? And so rethinking what literature could potentially look like in a digital space. Then the other thing for me is, as a graduate student in my department, I don't necessarily teach the same course over and over again. So to think about using a class hashtag longer than a particular course, I don't have that opportunity. Maybe down the road, absolutely, if I get to teach sort of multiple iterations, to be able to plug into that hashtag and to sort of have that narrative of what's gone on before, and have students be able to plug into that community. Absolutely, I think that would be fantastic. Yeah, but it's difficult, and yet if you start to think about things in new parameters, I think it could actually provide some really fruitful discussions.
Well,
answer the assessment part. So I teach courses that are usually of between 25 and 30 students that are heavily weighted on participation, but where there isn't always time for everyone to participate in the way that they want to. But it's like, I'm a humanist, I want to have discussion. So I sort of reverse engineered it to where like people get to participate, they have the option of participating in multiple ways. It's still between 35 and 40% of their grade, but I have a system where my TA counts all in-class and Twitter participation in a spreadsheet, which only works because I have a TA. I used to try to do this myself, and I'd be like teaching and marking some counts, and it doesn't really work. So I'm in a very privileged position that I can do this, but it works really well because they count the same. So an in-class comment and a tweet count the same. And I still look over the tweets. Like if I give them this whole guide to Twitter, and also a guide to asking critical questions. So if they're just posting things like, oh, this technology is so shiny, I tell them that that does not count as class participation. So there is some discernment around that, but I do just quantify it and give people credit for saying really smart things that, and instead of just like talking too much or whatever, and that part is subjective. But I find that just like having a document like that is helpful, and having another person do it, so I think that sort of stuff part of my brain is helpful too. And then I can just go back and look over it when I send it.
To piggyback off of that, one of the big things that I had to grapple with was students tweeting in German. So there's the whole language evaluation aspect, right? And for the purposes of this short story, one of the things that I really thought about was, in the grand scheme of things, if the ending of a particular adjective is off, it's not going to affect the overall expression and whether students can understand what that student tweeted about and build off of that. So really being understood in the foreign language and the target language was the primary aspect as far as language evaluation was concerned. But one of the things I did with my students is I created a rubric and I gave it to them. So they knew going into the project exactly how they were going to be evaluated, because it is a little bit up in the air for students to kind of think, okay, well, how is this going to factor into my grade, right? What's the value of an individual tweet? And so being upfront with your students about how you're going to evaluate that can really take a lot of that pressure off.
Just to add quickly to that, yeah. I've had assignments where the tweet is structured into an end product. For example, like a thesis statement workshop. I'll have them tweet. I wanted to include this in my presentation, but time. But the initial tweet would be a draft of a thesis statement, because it's almost a perfect medium, Twitter, 140 characters, right, for a thesis statement. And it would lead to a series of activities that would ultimately culminate in a thesis statement that's refined and workshopped, that will go through a workshop and a series of procedures that would ultimately be evaluated with a grade. So yeah, that's one way that, so it's something you must do in order to get, the grade that you need to get for this particular assignment.
Twitter, does that replace like a wiki or a discussion forum on Blackboard for you, or do you still use Blackboard in any way?
For my discussions, I mean, I would say our discussions generally, we use Twitter as the primary medium, where I could throw out discussion questions well in advance of the class, and students could start responding before class. We bring in the live feed into class. If there were questions within sort of the context of discussion that students felt like within the flow in class didn't quite fit, they could tweet it, and we could circle back to it when then there was a break in discussion. And so I felt like it felt a lot more organic to structure discussion in that way. In the Blackboard configuration for discussion boards, it felt a lot more separate from class discussion. And so using Twitter in that capacity felt a lot more fluid.
I don't use Blackboard, except to post like documents.
Yeah, I just use Blackboard for grading. I don't think the rest of it's very accessible.
So maybe we could build in a Twitter feed into Blackboard and then ta-da! Is there like a widget for that?
I have a question, not for the panelists, but for our audience. We had the 3 talks were pretty specific to your courses, right? You managed to integrate Twitter into the specific needs of those courses pretty well. It's a little bit harder to imagine, okay, I have a class that does something completely different. How I want to now, because you guys are it's very exciting. I'm curious how many of us are kind of having that same response, that sounds interesting for those people because their topics happen to fit so well. But how would you fit this into a class on, either something as far afield as history, or as actually far afield as in the sciences or beyond? Is there anybody here in the sciences who is thinking of using Twitter in their classes, a way of connecting to current events? And that seems to be kind of one obvious area. Has anybody else here used Twitter in the classroom? A couple?
I have noticed that there are people that tweet television shows. And I think it would be interesting, given your question, to ask students to tweet. So if you're a big History Channel person, or you're a big Discovery Channel person, as you're watching these shows, or these, or going to a movie, don't do this in a movie theater, but if you're watching these shows that are relevant to things that you're learning in the classroom, I could see tweeting as a potentially interesting way of connecting those things for the class.
Be interesting. I'm thinking out loud. I've never taught a large lecture at Vanderbilt. I used to at the University of Wisconsin. It'd be really interesting to think about a Twitter feed in a large lecture hall with TAs. I used to have 14 of them in my lecture for 700 students, monitoring the Twitter feed, responding, and perhaps even feeding live questions to the professor. Your science question prompted that for me.
I'm from a different university, but we have done this in the department. So it'll be like an in-class screening of a documentary, and there'll be like 2 screens and a live feed with the hashtag. So like I also work in disability studies, so I'm particularly sensitive to accessibility. In one sense, it's quite accessible. Like there's like different modalities, and you can engage, and also there's a pacing to students like thinking that they might be able to linger on a question and engage with the film in a different way. It's also, for a lot of students, I think it's an overload to have this at the same time. And I sense that there is, if you're asking them, for example, to do a close reading of a film, like you'd have to do a lot more structures, like ask them to think about particular scenes. Otherwise, like doing a kind of method training, teaching students how to read while also asking them to look at the Twitter feed, in some sense also detracts from their close engagement with the film. So not that I think it's good, the students really enjoy this. Also there's like the hoaxing, once like someone, like a friend outside of class gets to know the hashtag, they will sometimes embarrass their friends in front of the full lecture hall, which is like, you can like work with that and be like, oh, Twitter. But the students really like it. So I guess the question for the instructor is to make sure that you know exactly the objectives for the feed if you're going to do that, so that you, I don't think it would be so helpful if you wanted to teach close reading of a film. Because it's like there's like too much going on when you'd like them to understand shots and all that kind of stuff. But I could see it working in a lot of ways.
All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I have one quick closing comment I want to make. So this workshop series, in part, is meant to be for instructors, kind of by instructors. The first couple have been organized by Zoe, Derek, and myself, but this is really an opportunity for faculty who have either something you've done that you want to show. Come talk to us and we'll find a way of bringing it up, or a question that you want answered. You don't know how to do it, but you want to find a solution to how to do it. Please come talk to us. And for the next version, please come on April 7th and bring a friend. That would be great. We'd like to grow this into an activity that we can really have a bit of momentum with. So. And
one last thing, the hashtag is up there, so if you're looking for the back channel of today's talk, it's going to be there, and we'll storify the tweets so we can have them forever. And future talks, this is going to be our kind of umbrella hashtag. So if you have any ideas for future talks or you found something interesting, please use the hashtags.
Great, and join me with welcoming and thanking our speaker once again.